Welcome to the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast. My name is Dave Deacon, and this is episode 112. And every time we start a new episode, I remind you to hit the subscribe button, of course, where you get your podcast. But this time, I also want to announce that we have a Facebook page. That's right, we swore we would not do it, but people were asking where they could get the talking head videos, and we thought this would be a easy enough place to house all of those so everybody could share them. So when you're on the algorithm, go ahead and hit the like button on the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast Facebook page. And as always, if you hear something in this episode that you'd like to learn more about, you're able to find those resources on our website, reddirtagronomy.com. And while we're on that subject, I want to thank Bill Bremer, who sent a question this week. And Bill, your question is a really great one for Dr. Jason Warren. And since he's unable to make it on this recording, we will hold your question about improving the soil for next time that Jason is with us, which should be the next time that we record. If you have a question for the group, jump over to reddirtagronomy.com like we talked about and leave it there, or you can send an email directly, podcast@reddirtagronomy.com, and we will discuss your question on the next podcast. This episode was recorded on August 19th, 2022 at the Cimarron Research Station near Perkins. That's right, it was recorded live before I would say studio audience, but everybody had already left by then. This was the last stop for the sorghum field tours, where Dr. Brian Ernell and Dr. Josh Lofton were traveling the state, talking with producers and giving updates on the sorghum crop. Since the Payne County Extension Director Nathan Anderson was there too, we asked him to join us, and then he started to walk really quickly to his pickup, but Josh told him that we were afraid our ratings would drop since Jason was not going to be on the show this week, and then Nathan relented and he put on a headset. Thanks for taking one for the team, Nathan. So let's kick things off with a sorghum update, again recorded live from the Cimarron Research Station near Perkins, Oklahoma. So please pardon the traffic sounds behind us. And of course, you are listening to the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast. I guess let's start off with Josh. You've been going across the state.
I do the intros all the time.
You're the sorghum tour king,
yeah.
So just live up to your sorghum tour.
So Josh, you've been across the state talking sorghum with producers. Today we're actually doing a podcast at the Cimarron Valley Research Station at Perkins before a live studio audience. Yeah.
There goes the criminal bust.
Yeah. How about that? The Department of Corrections. Number one fans of the podcast.
Thanks for showing up, guys.
Yep. Be sure and sign in so you get the. But you've been homestead. You've been all across the state talking about sorghum. What are producers asking, and how does the sorghum look where you've been?
Basically, does it look as bad as my place does?
Right.
I think that's the general consensus. Yeah, actually, and surprisingly, Dave, we had these, and I was questioning on whether to have them because, in a lot of our locations, some of the sorghum just doesn't look great.
Right.
We saw that this morning. We're barely at homestead. It's rough country out there. They haven't had a whole lot of rain. Some of the sorghum hybrids are barely headed out, but yet there's still a lot of questions to be had, and some of those are some post-mortem on the crop on like what we did. Do we think that it actually worked? We won't be able to get yield to tell us if it did work, but we can kind of start drawing conclusions, and then a lot of questions on. We talked a lot about the agronomics, the fertility basics, and the economics of rolling up the crop for hay. What are the considerations that you have to do? And maybe in some instances, Brian, we talked about how it's just, even though it might be a loss this year, it might be a gain in the long run just to leave it be.
Yeah, I did that blog post about nutrients in the crop. It had been brought up several times that if you look at just the cost of the hay itself. So Nathan had done it, and Trent Milik out at Northwest area agronomist has looked at it, and cost of making a bale is $30, just mechanically, the wrap, that kind of stuff, diesel. But if we look at the nutrients, so if you bale up sorghum or corn hay right now off of a felled crop, in a ton of that crop, you're going to have about $20 worth of nitrogen, $10 worth of phosphorus, and $20 of potassium. So breaking it down to 1,000-pound bale, let's just easy number, 1,000-pound bale, you got $30 to make it, and you have 25 sitting in nutrients just in that bale right there. So you have to have that consideration of just, okay, what are you taking out and what are you going to get for it? Am I feeding it to my own cattle? Am I, do I have that value? If I'm going to sell it, I got to make sure I make back what I can replace, because taking a hay crop is different than a grain crop. So when we do our fertility recs for sorghum, we're looking at removing the nutrients from a bushel of sorghum and returning the residue back to the ground, where it's going to cycle the calcium, it's going to cycle the potassium. And so when you now bale it off, now you're removing a lot more than just a grain crop that you planned for. So you need to take that in considerations. And also, if you're a no-till farmer, what's the value of some extra residue on the surface this year going in? And we'll bring in Nathan here in a little bit. What if we just release the cattle out there? What are our considerations? What are considerations if we're baling a crop anyways that failed that might have high nitrate or prussic acid?
Yeah, and there's a lot of dynamics that go into that, and we've talked about it, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more today. But overall, we've on the tours we've seen a mixed bag. There's still a good amount of interest. I think we've universally at each location gotten more people there than we thought would end up being there. So there's still good interest, good folks that are coming out and seeing the varieties and and seeing how they're performing, because this is the type of year we can all take some varieties and see them in a good year like we had like last year and seeing how well they do and all that. But a lot of the time the best variety isn't maybe the one that'll pop off in a good year, but is the one that in this type of year you have to make that very hard decision on, do I take a 50 bushel grain crop, or is the hay worth more to me? And so these are the kind of varieties we want to take a gander at and have into our system, and as well as providing good service to the growers. It's also really good for the companies that are trying to market the best hybrids available for our growers. That way we're not putting out bad material for our growers to use, and if we have a year like this, then we have options available. So it's been pretty good. It's a very telling year this year on what things look like and how things are going to perform. So it's one of those years that you don't want to stand next to a trial. You aren't going to highlight this document and how well each variety does, but those are the years that maybe provide more very good information to growers and companies than the years that we can, we all like to see those 120 bushel years, but some years, especially in Oklahoma, that just doesn't exist. So
are you seeing any type of pressures along with the different sorghum trials across the state?
Yeah, I mean, we're picking up some things. This is, I think we've discussed all year, this is a year of weird things happening. We have, we've had blister beetles that, walk past a pigweed plant to eat a soybean plant. We've had chinch bugs in corn, chewing off silks and tassels, and we've found some mites in some of the sorghum that, are one of those things of like, well, this is not out of the question, but it is unusual. Right. So it is one of those things that, especially when you start digging around in these things that, especially some of these sorghum trials that, I think we expect sorghum to go through a lot, but I don't think anybody can sit out this year and say, we expect sorghum to take this kind of year and just keep on ticking. It's been a rough year, and so it's interesting to see some of these things. Probably not great to see them, but I mean, it's one of those things that it's added that another decision. Those mites are eating something, and so if potentially that door is starting to shut on how good a quality your hay is, and that's another decision you have to make is the quality going to be just so bad I'm going to have to supplement so much that that $55 bale might not be $55. It might be closer to $60, $75 if you have to supplement because it's just not good protein or anything like that. So it's a lot bigger of a decision process, and that's why I think we're still seeing growers trying to make decisions on their sorghum crop. We haven't seen all the sorghum be rolled up that I think could potentially be, because there's still a lot of decision making still going on it.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing on the decision is that Trent was saying for economics, if you want to just pay for the combine right now, it's about a 7 or 8 bushel. You need 7 or 8 bushel just to pay the combine to go through the field. And so, if you're in that close to that paying for the combine, you got to ask yourself, where are you at?
Mm-hmm.
And where we're at, one more time, we're at Perkins at the Cimarron Valley Research Station, and you've had a field tour here today in Payne County,
Mm-hmm.
and Nathan Anderson is the county extension director. And Nathan, how has sorghum performed across Payne County?
Well, I think what we've seen today is pretty much relevant all the way across the county. The majority of our tilled ground is in the northern part of the county and over towards the eastern side of the county. So I think the varieties have looked very similar. Had its real struggles early on trying to get good stands. There were fertility questions that I've passed on to Dr. Onraw, and it's the same struggle that we're seeing here at the field day today.
Are you hearing from producers that question that the guys have been asking about? Do I harvest it? Do I bale it? Do I graze it?
I think they're still just twiddling their thumbs, trying to figure out when is the time to make that desperate decision. And a lot of our producers are crops and livestock, so they see the value of hay now, and they wonder, well, this isn't going to pay. This grain crop isn't going to pay. What's my other options to get value out of it? So, and there's a lot of concerns related to that.
So if we start talking about the hay and something we can just jump right in at, and so Nathan is a lot of my go-to on the pasture. If we start looking at the hay crops, some concerns that we have to be paying attention to, hearing it all over, is nitrate and prussic acid when we start looking at baling up a sorghum crop, a corn crop, or even some of these pastures that are heavy Johnson grass. And so you can go in the county office, you can do the nitrate test, which is the diphenyl drop test, which is basically a yes or no.
Yes.
If it doesn't turn black, doesn't have nitrate. If it does, it has some level. But we've been talking around. So up in K County, they were saying, they only have a few thousand ppm when it shows up, which is not bad. But you've seen some really high values down here in Payne County. We've heard of some high in Garfield County.
I have, and Brian, it's very, very strange. I ask the producers when they come in and I do a drip test, was this field fertilized? How was it managed? Go through, try to figure out. Of course, they always ask you, do you think that's safe? Do you think it's safe? Yeah. Well, we're fixing to find out. Yeah. So, and I always tell them, to be very diligent, just like in soil testing, go out there and get good representation from across the field. Cut me a stalk as high as the swather would cut it, and cut me at least a dozen, one from 12 different spots in the field, because there's variation in soil types and fertilities, and if you take it all at the gate and they got a double pass on the fertilizer wagon there, we're not getting real. So I try to, that way if I do test, it does show me color, then I've got enough that I can cut it up, and we can send it into the lab. Very, very cheap test, $6 to get it tested and get an actual number. Yes, and what I was telling about the oddity of it, I'd have fertilized fields that would be below 3,000, which all of those are safe, and then I'd have an unfertilized field of sorghum Sudan that was very thin stand, covered up with weeds, and I tested that, and that was 24,000. 10,000's lethal.
Yeah.
So it's very odd, and I think it goes back to something that you said during the field day. With all these dry conditions, all this nitrogen's coming up, and that's the only answer that we can really come up with as why some locations are pulling up some high nitrates. I've had numerous 8,000 and 9,000. I had a 12, I had a 14, then I had this one that was 24,000. So it's great variation, and the majority of them are still in the hundreds.
Yep.
So
let me ask you, if you have a client that comes in and they test 24,000, what do you tell them to do with that?
Well, hopefully they haven't cut it, and we don't have any options. We've got to wait on the rain and let it grow out of it. That's stored in the stalk, in the stem of that plant. We have, and they get aggravated at me because they're trying to get in there and cut it as soon as possible. So we've just got to wait on a rain. Hopefully it's a good rain. Mm-hmm. We get some growth. I have guys turn around and bring me a sample 2 days after a rain. Well, there's a surge in that number for the first 2 or 3 days after that rain. We've got to wait 7 to 14 days before we get that number down to a safe proximity, at least where we're not being a threat to anything. And we got to know what we're feeding it to. Mm-hmm. If it's non-reproductive cattle, 5,000-6,000, we can manage that. That's not a problem. But you feed that to bred cows, and you're going to you could be losing a calf crop or some cows that gets high enough.
What about I've heard that a lot of if you're high nitrates and you just let it rain and let it dilute itself, basically is what it's doing.
Yes.
But we're at the point to where a lot of the sorghum ain't going to grow much anymore. So and my concern is, have you looked much on how much nitrate comes in the tillers that potentially could subsequently grow if we do get a rain? Because if we get a rain, I think that's the only thing that's going to grow, is especially on the grain. We're not maybe talking about sorghum sedan or forage sorghum. BMR sorghum might still have some growth left in it, but at least all the varieties we've seen, there's no more vegetation coming that isn't through a tiller. So I've always gone the indication that at this stage in the game, that nitrate's almost what you got to deal with, because if you let more tillers grow, that potentially could have higher nitrate, on some of that low growth.
That is all very true. Very, very, very true. But the nitrate is typically in the stalk, and so I test everything. I test the whole plant when they bring it in, but we always start with the stalk, especially in the nodes, see if we get in color. Then we go to various other places to see. Now, what worries me more is prussic acid in the tillers.
Yeah,
and then that is just as deadly.
Well, and then what if you're sitting at 12,000 nitrate plus, then you get prussic acid?
If they're going to cut it for hay, we don't have to worry about nitrate near as much. I mean, prussic acid near as much, because it's going to cure out. But if you think you're going to open the gate and try to get some return value, and hopefully, we're not mining those nutrients off that you've already paid for, we're returning it back, then yes, we definitely have to worry about prussic acid issues.
Can you take just a couple minutes and remind what curing a hay is? Because we've had some conversation that that art of curing might have been lost in places. People are putting up hay that may not have been properly cured. We did hear tell of some 1,600 pound 5x5 sorghum bales the other day. So my question is, that may not be cured.
I would guess they're not cured. I encourage a lot, especially the commercial guys that come in here and custom harvesting of these hay bales. We have a lot of producers that utilize them, but many still have their own equipment. I really encourage them to use a moisture meter. That way they've got a really good idea. It's not, it's like you looking at that field right there and then tell me what % protein is that plant right there. Well, you can make assumptions, but you're probably not going to be very accurate. Yeah. So if we go with some technology, those moisture meters, that's not a high price thing, and it can really make a difference. You talk about curing out based on prussic acid. Yes, we've got to do that to get it out. But I encourage it on other years, on normal, if anything is normal anymore. We get buildup of mold, and that causes issues too. So it's pure waste.
What's a good moisture on a sorghum hay or something like a sorghum forage?
Well, we try to get down there 10, 11, 12%. That's where we want that before we start rolling this stuff up. That's our goal.
Yep.
That's our goal.
Is that universal across corn as well?
I believe so.
Okay.
I've never heard any other moisture percentages that would vary. I've seen some legumes that, man, they'll roll that stuff up, and some of those bales turn black on you. But it's so high in sugar, but it was still cured, and it took a lot of time because they're big foliar type plants. talk about Austrian winter peas or something like that.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Nathan, because Josh and I were talking about this on the way to Homestead, and I couldn't remember the numbers. Do you remember what the numbers are for quality on baling soybean? Because there's going to be a lot of soybean rolled up in bales. My assumption is stemmier, so you probably have a little bit less feed value in it because a little bit heavier stem, but I can't remember protein-wise. Do you remember off the top of your head?
Not exactly. I think we can get some 12, 14% protein, but I say that, and if somebody goes and bales it out, and it turns out to be 6, well, maturity is always the factor.
Yep.
And how well the sample was taken of the hay, and there's a lot of issues.
Do you know of any particular concerns with feeding soybean hay, of anything, or is it
just that getting them used to it probably, because it is something different? No, I don't think there's any other issues other than, we've got to have protein, we've got to have TDN. They've got to be able to digest it, otherwise there's no need in really doing it. So, again, we go back to the standard numbers. A spring calving cow, during the times we're feeding her hay, she needs 9% protein, and we need at least 53% TDN. If that's a lactating cow, we need to shoot for 10, 11% protein and still 55, hopefully 55 or better TDN. If those, regardless of what it is, they will get acclimated to it if that's all that's out there.
Well, so, I think we've probably talked the sorghum thing to death, but we're 2 weeks from planting wheat season. We all know that Labor Day there's going to be some wheat going in the ground, moisture or not. What would you tell folks that are looking? Oftentimes because a lot of the pasture has kind of gone downhill, so they're looking for something to kind of head themselves into winter. What are you telling folks, not only on native pasture, but on upcoming potential wheat pasture?
Well, on the wheat pasture, you talk about Labor Day and planting wheat. Some of these guys, a lot of our wheat in Payne County is used for graze out or hay. They're going to put it up in March and put up some pretty decent quality hay. A lot of them guys used to start planting middle of August.
Yeah.
Well,
that's what I was thinking.
There's no way. There's,
there's a way.
Well,
you can put seed in the ground.
You've seen the recent forecast.
Yeah.
We were in the 1 to 2 inch range. Boy, I'm sure that give people they're
excited.
Beaming. They went to greasing the planters, I'm sure. But now it's wheeled down to about 3/10. So I imagine they've still just left it in the barn. But if we put that wheat seed out there and it gets 3/10, what's going to happen? You guys know what's going to happen. It's going to germ and die because we're probably going to get another one of these heat waves. High possibility of another heat wave after this. Again, we go back to playing averages though. That's what we have seen here in Payne County is, and we've talked about it on late summer fertilization to extend some high quality forage, standing forage that we don't have to roll up, and reduce our hay amounts that we need to put out. Plus, it also ramps up our protein in it, and it reduces our supplementation. So, that is just.
I mean, so I'll throw that. Would you advising somebody? Let's say somebody's got more acres and a lot of stuff to do. Would it be worth maybe putting a field or two in, rolling the dice on it, and just saying this may have to be a replant, but if we get rain, now we've got a couple fields set early?
That's a high possibility.
We've talked about this a lot. Is the diversification in this climate might be one of those that we can't play safe on 110% of the acres. That we may have to roll the dice on a few, because if it hits, awesome. But if you don't have anything, you don't have anything.
Then you're just out of luck.
Yeah.
Yeah, then you're going back and saying, well, do I harvest this grain sorghum out here, or do I bale it up?
Yeah.
And how much does soil temperature play in actual planting of wheat? Brian totally rolled his eyes.
No, well, I actually just saw Jimmy Kinder sharing some data from the Southwest from Walters on their soil temps and their soil moisture. They're still holding 15 degrees higher than the average is right now, so their soil temps are still 97.
Well, that's why, yeah.
I don't know. It might just be bacon rather than growing right now.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about trying to get a soil test out here. Man, trying to get a soil probe in the ground anymore is just a pretty tough deal.
Mm-hmm. So and that's not our thing. We'd have to bring Silva on, but there's a lot of coleoptile length, hot germ, dealing with those things you have to be careful of. But hot soils, you get this tender plant germinating, and all of a sudden your soil temps are 100 degrees. There's nothing good about that.
Well, and then the heat right above the soil too.
That's right.
Because as it emerges, it's getting zapped with all that extra temperature too.
Yeah, and I mean, just look at how cool we've been the last couple of days, per se. Cool, been in the 80s and stuff like that. Our soil temperature around the state is 80s at the low, 98 at the high, 100 at the high.
Wow.
This weekend's going to be 96 degrees, so that soil temperature with no moisture is just going to start heating back up again.
Yeah, and bare soil for all this work ground, it's going to be hotter than anything else. It's going to catch that. I mean, we've been standing in work ground all day long, and I promise you, standing over in grass is a lot better. That work ground is hot right now.
Well, you're saying about soil temperature right here, right now, 4 inches is 94.
Yeah.
Wow. 4 inches is 94. That's good stuff.
Yeah, so that is a thing that this is still, heat wave, or even though it's not 105 anymore, we're still, I don't know if you would say above average, but we're still warmer than we probably should be to go start throwing wheat in the ground, especially with these. And it's this sporadic rainfall events that can dump a half inch, and then basically at that point in time your wheat's dead before it even knows it.
Right, exactly. You asked me what I would recommend to people, and that's just a tough question to do, and it's just that's agriculture. Yeah, it is a roll of the dice. This is you try to give them every option of, we can do half, leave the other half, just in case this doesn't work. Try to lay out every scenario possible. We were talking about grain sorghums and baling that, but it made me think of something else. One thing that we probably need to warn producers about, we need to look at are there any herbicides that are applied to these crops that are affecting the forage quality? So, do you guys know of any?
So, on the sorghum and corn, there's a little less concern.
Yeah.
Some of the big concerns are soybean. When you get to the list of soybean herbicides of what can or cannot be grazed, and I've got that on that blog post. I hyperlinked to Missouri. University of Missouri had a lot of that. They do a lot of that. There was a lot of soybean herbicides that were a 90, 120 day or no graze at all.
A lot of them didn't even have a timetable.
Yeah, just said no.
Just no. And some of those are not herbicides we use commonly in the state, but some of them are. So
I mean, with so many of the soybean herbicides now, they're not a single active. We got so many blends. That's what we got to be careful of, because there's so many names for multiple blends. And so that's one of my concerns with some of the soybean hays. You better know what you got on it and look at some of this work that's been done and see if you can feed it.
When it comes to pasture preparation for the winter, what does it look like for the Payne County producer? What options do we have? Because I'm just across the line in Noble County, Chad Webb's county.
Right.
I'm kind of wondering what we're going to do for our 15, 20 head that we're about to put out.
Are you saying that you're asking advice for Nathan for Chad's
Well,
county?
I cover him a lot.
Well, I'm just saying that because Chad's not here.
Yeah, we make him the target.
Right.
Dave, there's hard decisions going to be made. One thing that I see a lot, and you drive around these county roads and you look at these fields, There are a lot of producers that are way overstocked. So this is going to force them to get back down to a manageable number. And with the prices, you've heard these two talk about the prices of fertilizer and supplementation. It's out of this world, and grain sorghum short and corn short. What's price is going to be this fall? It's a scary deal. We have got to learn to get more out of the ground and manage that. And a lot of things that we've done this year is showing them, even though there was $1,100 fertilizer, we could still make it pay because of the return we were getting from it. And we've got to do more of that rather than just let's roll up hay and dump out cubes all winter long. And we've tried to look at other varieties of extending the grazing system, having a year-round grazing system, quit relying on rolled up hay. Like they've always said, the round baler was the best and worst invention ever made. But we've got to get more out of the ground, and we've got to manage that land right. We've got to have right stocking rates so we can weather the storm right now. I can take you to some places, and you'll go, wow, this looks great.
Yeah.
And then I can take you to others that look like that plowed ground right over there.
Yeah.
So we've got to manage it right, or those tough decisions are going to have to be made, and there are a lot of them going to town. They really are.
I will say, Nathan, at least driving around across the state, that I've been pleasantly surprised in that it looks like some did. There's not as much ground that's as wore out as it did in 11 and 12. I feel like at this point in some of those years, we were a lot worse shape on more acres. So there is some, but there are some stuff that's overstocked without question.
Yes, but that was also a 2.5-year drought.
It was a 2.5-year drought. You're right.
And we're in year one.
Year one.
So we've got to keep watching that. And with the elevated prices back in 11, 12, and 13, fertilizer wasn't, $1,100 a ton like it was this spring, and supplementation wouldn't cost you $480, $500 a ton to do that. Hay on the market hay did go high, but it come right back down after, things kind of leveled out a little bit. But we've got to be better managers. We've tried to look at extended grazing system. Back to your word of diversification, have a diversified grazing crops out there that we can go to, cool seasons, looking at perennials, annuals, all those things, incorporating them so we can manage everything a little better.
If we don't get rain, is this a year that we don't look at interseeding wheat into some of the Bermuda grass, or
well, we're going to have the same success with it on a grain crop.
Yeah, fair enough.
Moisture's moisture. We got to have it. Ag relies on water.
There are benefits to just letting a pasture set.
Yes, it is always good. And when we come out of that 11, 12, 13 drought, we were advising people, especially on native grasses, you've got to let those fields rest. You've got to give them some rest. And a lot of people, when they talk about fertility, they only think nitrogen.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe I'm wrong, but I've been telling a lot of my producers, these stressful situations, whether it's heat or drought or a combination of both, what if we have a severe cold spell like the Armageddon of a year ago, February? What is that going to do to grass stands? We have depleted their energy source because it's taken everything to get us to today. So I've been really encouraging people to go back now and put in that phosphorus and potash, because that is what is going to replenish that and keep that stand growing it, so we're not having to spend $200 an acre reestablishing a permanent grass.
And I've been on that even without drought. I've been on that a little bit of a bandwagon on our natives that have been maybe mismanaged because we're not letting them rest as well on some of our natives as maybe we should, and just the whole thought of it's native so it doesn't need fertility. There's this whole scientific concept called mass balance. If I'm pulling beef off, then I'm pulling nutrients out. And so if I continue to pull things off, if I'm selling beef off of a native or if I'm haying it, I'm pulling nutrients. And so that whole native pasture no fertility thing for me has always been a net negative, because we're pulling P and K, which is extremely important for stand survivability, for the ability to make it through winter and then come out in the spring. But it's been interesting. So I work with the oysters out west of town. I've got some Bermuda grass research on them. Those guys manage well. They try to do their best for fertility with baling, and they came to me after their first baling this year and were heavily disappointed because others that may not manage as well as they do, or put the inputs or the time spent, were cutting more. And I had to let them know it's probably because they managed to the fullest on the previous year, because they went ahead, they cut the right height, but they had that third cutting, and the third, or I guess it would be a second cutting. The late cutting last season probably hurt them coming into this spring as far as some regrowth, and it was coming up. And I've seen a lot of that where the stuff that was pushed a little harder last year kind of took it on the chin a little bit on the first cutting this year. And so even when you're managing it right, when you have a long-term drought like this, it's hard on the system.
Yeah, and they're excellent producers, and I'm sure they follow soil recommendations and replenish the P and K. And, I mean, it's still, like you said, Dave, go back. There needs to be a rest period in there. And so I very much agree with all that. And, you know, there's a lot of research through OSU that says, yeah, it's not economically feasible to do native grasses. But one thing I do, I have a lot of native hay meadows that come to me, and they said it's just not performing. So we do a soil test, and I do recommend fertilizer, and it's not near as demanding as some of the improved forages, but it still needs a boost, especially after a drought or hard winter or something like that. That is I'll tell you, biggest problem I see in native grasses: people's taking that cutting way too late. They're waiting till now and waiting till Labor Day. We're supposed to take that to middle of July and get off of it so that stuff can replenish. If you do that Labor Day cutting every year, that stand is going to thin so much you're going to eventually lose that stand. Then you hit adverse conditions like this or a winter, and it's gone because you removed all the seed. You're not replenishing anything. And now you're back to about $200, $250 an acre to reestablish, if you calculated all the expense of reestablishing permanent grass back in.
So, Josh, with that, and I understand this is more of a Alex Rocatelli question, but you office just down the hall from him, so I'm going to ask you.
He's closer.
Well, I guess you're right. I guess I could ask Brian, but
Josh hasn't said anything. He needs to speak.
So, what would be some options for pastures from a not a crops side of it, but some way to plant a seed, get something in a year like this that would help cattle make it through the winter.
In a year like this?
In a year like this.
I'm glad he asked you and not me.
I'm trying to summarize the question. That way I can turn here and say, so Nathan, what is something that you could put seed-wise in a well, and I mean, that's hard, and that was going to be my next question to Nathan is that when we look in the future, let's just say that things get better, but what if they don't get better till spring? What are we doing to extend some of these things that might be worn out, for right now? Is we always talk cover crops. And people, don't go onto Twitter and say the word cover crop right now. That it would be You are setting yourself up for a long scrolling period. But I mean, there's cover crops have always been an option, but it's been one of those things that they come with a risk. Well, this year we realized that risk on some of the folks that did cover crops is they potentially provide some good winter cover. They did that, and they potentially provided some good potential forage over the winter and the early spring, and they did that. But they already started draining the moisture, and we've had plots that basically had cover going into it that the corn's still about a foot and a half tall. Just because it's just never going to get any further. So the cover crops are an option, but it's once again, you're typically a lot higher dollar than wheat is, or just putting out a single grass, and And I'm not sure I'm at the point to spending a lot of money on something like a cover crop when we don't know what's going to happen 2 months down the line. If we had even if we had a dry top and we had some good profile moisture, and it was like all we had to do was connect it. But Brian, that's kind of like what we saw at Homestead this morning, is we had a dry top and a moist layer, but guaranteeing underneath that small moisture layer, which is probably a 3-inch storm that they got a couple of weeks ago.
3.9 inches in a small area.
And so you can see that 6 inches down, but guaranteed to a certain point, maybe 2 foot down, it's probably dry again.
Yeah.
And so that's a lot different of a scenario than what I would consider a true flash drought, to where we still got potentially good deep soil moisture, but we're dry on top. Right now we're dry probably to quite a bit depth.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how much extra money I'd be spending until I'm sure that there's some things turning around. Because even the cover crops, we planted some cover crops, and thanks, Dave, for that. We're going to have a soil health field day, September 1st at the Agronomy Research Station in Stillwater, Oklahoma.
Where can people sign up for it, Josh?
You don't even have to RSVP. You can just show up. And guess what? The OSU football game is that day. I didn't even plan it. It's just that good that's going to be there. The first OSU football game. But where I was going with that is those cover crops that we've even irrigated up aren't doing great right now, because they're constantly working on just a small fraction of moisture that every time we irrigate, that soaks that first couple of inches. But when you get a little bit deeper and you get down in some of the deeper soil, it's dry. And so you're setting yourself up for a cold winter or hard winter, or maybe even a dry spring, where the roots are going to be very shallow, and you're potentially spending some money and maybe not getting that return on investment. Now, if things turn around in the next month, you might get me to say something different. But as of right now, I don't know how much high dollar practices I'm throwing out onto a farm. Now, I'm with Brian. I'm willing to plant some wheat in some fields to hope that it works. But am I going to plant a $30 an acre cover crop mix? That gets a little harder to digest right now. In a month, we've had a couple of inches of rain. I might be willing to argue that with some of these guys, but right now, that is hard to digest.
You guys are just depressing. Why did y'all ask me?
We were hoping you would be happy.
We've been like that since we started in March.
Nathan, you're the ray of sunshine today. You got to make it work.
But I did want to go back to that question. Is that let's say we're looking towards, and I'm going to say this really quietly, but Todd Bauman, if this doesn't happen, it's his fault, because he retweeted it on Twitter. Looking at our long range forecast for next spring has the potential to be wetter than average. So let's say that comes to fruition. That is a future we are hopefully looking at. So let's say March we're going to be wetter than average, but maybe until then we're drier or as normal. What would you tell guys heading into winter, or any of your producers heading into winter that could get us to that point? Don't want to liquidate a herd. So what are we going to do?
Well, we've got to look at supplementation to help them along, but then I'd go back to Brian's idea and do half the crop, half the fields, and try the wheat, take a shot, roll the dice, see if it works. Maybe we can struggle along. We're going to have to find some kind of hay, some kind of roughage, and use supplementation to keep that genetic herd base that we want to keep, especially those core cows. Then go into spring and looking at other cool season annuals. Crop guys don't want to hear it, but the ryegrasses and things like that, and the spring oats, and then hopefully we can just get a shot and maybe, jump this hurdle and make it.
And Nathan, we were talking about the field day that, typically in a year like this, we'd be recommending on the Bermuda grass side to be hitting it a little shot right now to stockpile would be trying to fertilize for a stockpile. So right now we start talking about, do we fertilize and try to stockpile? And my thought was, if you've already fully fertilized or you have what you would have down for a normal year, then I wouldn't be adding more, because we haven't had a normal year. But if you've gone in and didn't buy any of that expensive fertilizer in the spring, you've been running on basically reserves from the past, then it might not be a bad idea to get a little nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium out there and hope that we get a little bit of late growth before we freeze off and have a little stockpile. If nothing else, a stockpile, it should help us go into and harden off and be better to come out in the spring, especially if we do have a good spring coming out, and that Bermuda grass will have more energy reserved in the roots and be able to take off and compete. It's been a rough couple years with our annuals weeds coming up, and because the Bermuda grass has been a little delayed. So anything we could do to help that Bermuda grass to get out of the ground a little bit earlier, a little bit stronger, it isn't a bad idea. Now, I'm not going out full bore NPK right now, but if I haven't had anything down in a while on my good Bermuda grass, I'm not opposed to putting a little bit out. Prices have settled a little bit, and so there is some value in that.
Sure, and if you can afford the P&K to go with it, that'd be an opportune time. That would be great. But also, like we discussed earlier too, shot of lime may really help. Be greatly beneficial at this time too, and it didn't fluctuate in price that much like fertilizer did.
Well, so let me go back to, once again, we had some intellectual conversations on the way out to Homestead this morning, where we saw a lot of pastures that have been windrowed, and some really tiny windrows, and we get that question a lot, of, hey, we're getting a little dry on a normal year, my quality's about to go down, but I don't have the tonnage we need. Those are on normal years when I would tell folks, hey, if you got good quality, you're already got a decent sized crop, go ahead and cut it. What about these fields that are potentially windrowed? Brian, windrows were barely creeping out of the straw.
They were double pass windrow, and I don't think they had anything more than 3 or 4 inches tall and 2 foot wide. I don't know a baler could pick it up. And
so if you go to that on losing quality because we're drying up grass, getting stemmy, but you need to make that one more pass, or you think you need to make that one more pass to stockpile or get a little extra hay. Do you wait, or do you go with a small bale or those small windrows to just try to get something that's decent quality, or do you try to wait for maybe another rain to flush it up again and maybe get one last shot of growth on it? And I know that takes some crystal ball looking,
it does.
But
it does. Another rolling of the dice. But if you're thinking about doing the late summer fertilization, that needs to be done, early September.
Yeah.
So we're supposed to be down to 3 to 4 inches before that application's made. And when you're waiting on one rain, you're usually waiting on 2. So rather than spend the money, I think I would have grazed it off rather than go to expense of rolling it up and moving it twice. And that's a lot of money. People don't realize. We're trying to look at utilize them as standing crops rather than putting that many more dollars into a bale of hay. But we still got to get it down to 3 or 4 inches. We typically go with 50 units in, and then have that done. If you look at our historical weather pattern, first 10 days of September, we usually have nice rain. That's what we have been measuring it off. Again, is anything normal or average?
My fear on those guys that went ahead and swathed is, I'm hoping we get regrowth. The later we wait on swathing our crops, it's not just the natives, it's Bermuda grass. The later we pull that off and don't allow it to recover and put the reserves back down, because it's going to put more energy in, it can make our springtime harder. And so as we keep cutting lower and we don't get a lot of growth, there may be more downstream negatives to taking a short crop right now than just leaving it out there and having it to be able to put the reserves back in for the next season. And I'd rather see cattle put out, because it's at a proper stocking rate and not grazed down, but leave 3 or 4 inches of biomass out there. Don't get it grazed down, than just swathing it down to 2 or 3 inches tall and us not get that September rain and be able to put in. So I'm really cautious on this last minute baling on short crop.
Well, and another thing is, and I'm kind of shooting from the hip now. I don't have the research to.
That's literally this whole podcast.
The research to back this up, but so many people have disc mowers now, and they're shaving the ground. Man, that plant, we've got to have leaf, we've got to have the solar panels, or it will not recover under any condition. And I think you raise that cutter bar up, you're going to save yourself a lot.
Yeah.
Just by raising that cutter bar, then you're to the point of, is there enough even that to go out there and mow?
Yeah. Well, so we've talked a lot about, your stuff and do you cut this, and what are you hearing around for? Is there enough hay? You said, hey, if you don't have enough, there's supplementation. What happens? When you don't have enough hay, you're getting there. Is there enough hay going around? Is it getting expensive? Where are we sitting at on the hay market right now?
Right now, I'm seeing hay anywhere from I've seen it advertised from 80 up to 140 a bale. And if you're in the market and you've got to have some, I understand it. It's desperate times, but I would have that stuff tested.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of ditches being bailed up right now, and who knows what else. But I would also want to test on nitrate too. But I'd sure like to see a basic analysis run on it and get the protein and TDN, because $80 for fodder is one thing, and $80 for 6% protein and 53 TDN, that's total. That might not be a bad deal, but I mean they're going to have some kind of roughage to make it through. And if you don't have the roughage, you can't find the roughage, then we have to sell.
Josh did this earlier, so I'm going to give a stab at it. Watch this. Okay, you guys ready? And of course, people can go to their county extension office and have help with the forage test. How was that? Was that okay? Was it not
That's
great?
almost like sunup.
Almost. But in honesty, I mean, they can come to you if they do buy the hay and they don't know what to do with a forage test.
Yes, we can do all that testing.
Yeah, soil testing lab right now is running hard on forages. They are turning burn. In fact, they are, for their soils to do the nitrogen test, total nitrogen tests, and carbon. They've moved to my lab so they could basically focus all of their for their total nitrogen. This isn't for their This is their protein analysis, so they could focus all machines on their forages because they are doing nonstop nitrate
testing.
Forage.
Yeah.
And so those folks in Swallowful are working hard right now.
You bet.
When it comes to overgrazing a pasture, and there's no grass, good grass left, but just weeds. What should a producer be thinking about whenever they're left with broomweed, whenever they're left with just a pasture of weeds?
Well, when you get to that, there's no value, no quality in that. I mean, you're going to have to buy it and replace that forage that isn't growing. So you're going to have to buy that $80 to $140 round bales just to sustain them, and that's all there is to it. And Josh was talking about cutting it down to 3 inches. Well, anytime you open the canopy, if we do that, and we tried this late summer fertilization and we didn't get the moisture and it didn't really grow that extra ton, because that's what we normally will see as a result of that, then that canopy's open, more susceptible to cold situations. Also opens a canopy, you're going to have more weeds next year. So we always tell the producers this: if you can't afford fertility and herbicide, always kill the weeds. Pound of weeds could have been a pound of grass.
Yeah, that's true.
So
and we did a lot of this, and hopefully we won't need it, but 12, 13, and even 14, we did a lot of pasture work on bringing pastures back, and
rejuvenation.
That is rest, stocking rate, herbicide, making sure your soils are in good condition, rest.
Did you say rest?
I think you said rest.
Yeah. but is a little bit of herbicide management, make sure your P and K fertility is even more important than your pH on that point for recovery, or your nitrogen, and just keeping some of those weeds down and letting that grass come back.
And we hope they all remember these situations. Yeah. Not that we want to live them again, but keep that right stocking rate, so we're not putting that much pressure on this forage. Again, we We can't make it without water.
Yep, that's true. Pray for rain and don't complain about the mud.
There you go.
There you go.
I always complain when my mud gets a little too muddy. I don't know.
And that, my friends, is the end of the Red.
You know, that really is a good way to kind of wrap things up with that. So, I guess I'll do the official close now by saying thank you for listening in on this conversation of the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast. And if you'd like to join us for the next conversation, send us an email to podcast@reddirtagronomy.com or send us a tweet. Our handle is RedDirtAg. We would like to thank Oklahoma State University Extension Director for Payne County, Mr. Nathan Anderson, for joining us on the podcast today. And to find out more about him or any of our guests, along with any of the resources that they talked about today or any other previous episode, visit reddirtagronomy.com. There you will find show notes, and again, you can listen to past episodes too. So for Dr. Josh Lofton, Dr. Jason Warren, and Dr. Brian Arnell, I am Dave Deacon, and we would like to thank you for listening. The proceeding is a copyrighted recording of Ag Now Media, LLC. And yes, all rights are reserved.